The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small cafe on the corner of a bustling street in Portland. It was a typical morning rush, with patrons lining up for their daily caffeine fix. Baristas worked in a rhythmic harmony, grinding beans, steaming milk, and calling out names with a practiced ease. At a corner table, a young woman tapped away on her laptop, headphones perched over her ears, while a couple nearby laughed over a shared pastry. It was a scene of everyday life, bustling and peaceful at once. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. The door swung open and a man in his late 40s stepped inside, shaking off the dampness of a light drizzle. He wore jeans, a simple jacket, and a red hat emblazoned with the words, "Make America Great Again." The hat seemed almost to glow in the hip, liberal ambiance of the coffee shop. Conversations faltered, and a few heads turned. The man, oblivious to the sudden shift in the room's energy, walked up to the counter, pulling out his wallet. "Good morning," he greeted the barista, a young man with dyed blue hair and a nose ring. "I'll have a large black coffee, please." The barista's smile faltered, his eyes darting to the hat. His cheerful tone vanished, replaced by something colder. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. "We don't serve people like you here." The man blinked, confused. "People like me? I'm just here for a coffee." The barista folded his arms, tilting his head slightly. "We have the right to refuse service, and we don't support what that hat stands for. You'll have to leave." A murmur swept through the cafe, a ripple of discomfort and unease. Some patrons looked away, pretending not to notice, while others openly stared, their expressions a mix of curiosity and approval. The man adjusted his hat, his jaw tightening. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "This is America. I came here to buy a cup of coffee, not to make a statement." "You already made your statement when you walked in with that hat," the barista shot back. His colleagues behind the counter exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the situation play out. The man took a deep breath, his frustration evident but tempered by restraint. "Listen," he said, trying to keep his tone measured. "I'm not here to argue politics. I'm just a guy who wants a coffee." The barista stood firm. "We don't support hate here," he said, his voice rising slightly. The room grew quieter. A young woman with a rainbow pin on her backpack nodded approvingly, while an older gentleman in the corner shook his head in dismay. The man in the MAGA hat looked around, sensing the judgment from all sides. He stepped back, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "I'll take my business elsewhere." As he turned to leave, the door swung open again and an older woman walked in. She was dressed in a modest blouse and skirt, her silver hair neatly styled. She noticed the tension immediately, her eyes darting from the barista to the man walking away. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and commanding. "What's going on here?" The barista hesitated, caught off guard. "We refuse service," he said, gesturing to the man's retreating figure. "We don't serve people who wear that." The woman's eyes narrowed as she looked at the red hat. Then she turned to the barista, her expression stern. "You refuse to serve him because of a hat? Isn't that against your company policy?" The barista faltered. "We have the right to refuse service to someone causing a disturbance," the woman interrupted, her tone sharp. "Not someone quietly ordering a coffee. Do you understand the difference?" The cafe fell silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. The man in the MAGA hat stopped near the door, curious but cautious. The barista opened his mouth to respond, but the woman raised a hand, silencing him. "This is discrimination, plain and simple," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "And if you think you're standing on some moral high ground, you're mistaken. Respecting someone's right to their beliefs doesn't mean you endorse them. It means you're respecting the values this country was built on." A few patrons nodded, murmuring in agreement. The tension in the room shifted, uncertainty creeping into the faces of those who had initially sided with the barista. The woman turned to the man, her gaze softening. "Sir," she said, addressing him directly, "would you like to have a cup of coffee with me?" He hesitated, caught off guard by her unexpected kindness. Sure," he said, adjusting his hat. She smiled and gestured for him to follow her to the counter. "We'll take 2 coffees, please," she said to the barista, who looked flustered but complied. As the drinks were prepared, she turned to the man. "I don't agree with your politics," she said plainly. But I don't agree with treating someone poorly because of their beliefs either. That's not who I am, and it's not who we should be. He nodded slowly, processing her words. Thank you, he said, his voice sincere. I didn't come here to cause trouble, I just wanted a coffee. The two of them sat at a table, their conversation drawing curious glances. As they spoke, the atmosphere in the cafe began to thaw. The woman listened patiently as the man shared his perspective, and he in turn listened as she explained hers. It was a moment of connection in a world that often felt divided beyond repair. By the time they finished their coffee, the tension in the cafe had all but dissipated. The barista, chastened by the exchange, approached their table. I'm sorry, he said, his voice quiet. I shouldn't have refused you service. That was wrong of me. The man nodded, accepting the apology. We all make mistakes, he said. What matters is learning from them. As the man and the woman left the cafe, they exchanged a warm goodbye. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sun peeked through the clouds, casting a golden light on the street. The man adjusted his hat once more, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had come for a cup of coffee and left with something far more meaningful, a reminder that even in a divided world, understanding was still possible. Back inside, the barista glanced at the remaining patrons who were now engaged in quiet conversation. He resolved to approach his work with a renewed sense of fairness and respect, regardless of the challenges. The lesson learned that day lingered in the air, as tangible as the smell of coffee. Sometimes it takes a moment of conflict to remind us of our shared humanity. As the man stepped out of the cafe, the woman at his side, he paused for a moment to take in the scene around him. The streets were busy, as always, with the ebb and flow of pedestrians weaving through the city's rhythms. But something inside him had shifted. The encounter in the coffee shop had left him thoughtful, reflective in a way he hadn't been in a long time. He glanced at the woman walking beside him, her stride steady and deliberate. You didn't have to do that, you know, he said, his voice tinged with gratitude. Most people would have just kept their heads down. The woman smiled softly, tucking a stray strand of silver hair behind her ear. Maybe so, she replied, but I've never been one to stand by when I see something unfair. My name's Margaret, by the way. Brian, he responded, extending a hand. She shook it firmly, and they continued walking down the street. Margaret stopped at the edge of a small park, gesturing to a bench beneath a leafy tree. Do you have a moment to sit? She asked. I feel like we didn't really get to talk back there. Brian hesitated, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. He wasn't sure what more there was to say, but something about Margaret's demeanor, warm yet unyielding, made him curious. He nodded and followed her to the bench. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching as children played on the swings and joggers passed by on the path. The rain had cleared completely, leaving the air crisp and clean. You know, Margaret began, this country has always been divided in one way or another. Politics, race, religion, you name it. But what I saw in that coffee shop today wasn't just a disagreement. It was a kind of unwillingness to even see another person as human. Brian nodded slowly, staring at the gravel path beneath their feet. It feels like that more and more, he admitted. I didn't wear this hat today to make a point. It's just part of who I am. But everywhere I go, it's like I'm being judged before I even open my mouth. Margaret tilted her head, studying him thoughtfully. Do you know why that is? She asked, her tone curious rather than accusatory. Brian shrugged. I have my ideas. People assume the worst. They think anyone who supports the guy on this hat is some kind of monster. Margaret let out a soft sigh, crossing her legs and leaning back on the bench. It's complicated, she said. People don't just see a hat. They see what it represents to them personally, whether that's fear, anger, hope, or pride. For some, it's a reminder of policies or rhetoric that hurt them or their loved ones. For others, it's a symbol of something they believe in deeply. Does it offend you? Brian asked suddenly, his eyes meeting hers. When you saw me wearing it, what did you think? Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked out at the park, her gaze distant. I'll be honest, she said finally. When I saw it, I felt a little defensive, like I needed to brace myself for whatever might come next. But then I reminded myself of something I learned a long time ago. You can't know someone's story just by looking at them. Brian nodded again, absorbing her words. I wish more people thought like that, he said. It's exhausting, feeling like I have to defend myself everywhere I go. Margaret gave him a small, sympathetic smile. It's not just you, Brian. Everyone feels judged in some way. That barista back there? He probably thinks he's standing up for something important too. And maybe he is, but that doesn't mean he handled it the right way. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the noise of the park filling the gaps in their conversation. Brian found himself relaxing, the tension from the coffee shop gradually melting away. "You're a good listener," he said after a while, breaking the quiet. "Most people just want to yell their opinions at each other." Margaret chuckled softly. "I've had a lot of practice," she said. "I was a teacher for 30 years. You learn pretty quickly that listening is just as important as speaking, sometimes more so." Brian raised an eyebrow. "A teacher, huh? What did you teach?" "History," Margaret replied, a note of pride in her voice. "I've always believed that understanding where we come from helps us figure out where we're going. Not that it's a perfect science," she added with a wry smile. Brian leaned back on the bench, folding his arms across his chest. "What do you think history would say about all this? The division, the anger, the everything?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "History would say it's nothing new," she said finally. "Every generation faces its own struggles, its own conflicts. But it would also say that progress is possible, if we're willing to work for it." Brian frowned, his brow furrowing. "Sometimes it feels like progress just makes things worse," he said. "Like we're tearing each other apart instead of coming together." Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but grounding. "It's easy to feel that way when you're in the middle of it," she said. "But think about this. We're sitting here having this conversation, even though we probably disagree on a lot of things. Isn't that something?" Brian glanced at her, a reluctant smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah," he admitted. "I guess it is." They continued talking for a while, their conversation weaving between personal stories, shared experiences, and moments of quiet introspection. Margaret told him about her years in the classroom, the challenges she'd faced, and the students who had inspired her. Brian shared his own struggles, from navigating a changing world to grappling with the loss of his job during the pandemic. They found common ground in unexpected places, their differences fading into the background. As the afternoon wore on, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. Margaret glanced at her watch and sighed. "I should be getting home," she said, standing up and brushing off her skirt. "My husband will start to wonder if I've gotten lost." Brian stood as well, stuffing his hands back into his jacket pockets. "Thanks for sitting with me," he said. "I didn't realize how much I needed to talk to someone." Margaret smiled warmly. "Anytime," she said. "And Brian, don't let anyone make you feel less than you are, but also don't stop trying to understand where they're coming from. It goes both ways." Brian nodded, her words sinking in. "I'll try," he said. "And thanks again for everything." They parted ways with a handshake, each walking in opposite directions but carrying the weight of their conversation with them. Brian found himself thinking about Margaret's words long after they'd said goodbye. He replayed the encounter in the coffee shop, questioning his own reactions and wondering what he could have done differently. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of bridging the divides that seemed so insurmountable. Margaret, meanwhile, returned home to her cozy house on a quiet street. Her husband, a retired engineer, greeted her at the door with a kiss on the cheek. "How was your day?" he asked, handing her a cup of tea. She smiled, sinking into her favorite chair by the window. "Interesting," she said. "I met someone today who reminded me why it's so important to keep talking, even when it's hard." Her husband raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That sounds like a story," he said, sitting down across from her. Margaret nodded, taking a sip of her tea. "It is," she said, a thoughtful look on her face. "And it's one I hope more people will be willing to hear." In the days and weeks that followed, both Margaret and Brian found themselves reflecting on their encounter. For Brian, it became a catalyst for seeking out more conversations with people who didn't share his views. He began attending community events, listening more than he spoke, and challenging his own assumptions. Margaret, inspired by her own advice, started volunteering at a local nonprofit dedicated to fostering dialogue between different groups in the city. She brought her wisdom as a teacher to the table, helping others navigate the complexities of their disagreements. Their paths crossed again, months later, at a town hall meeting focused on bridging political divides. Margaret spotted Brian in the crowd, his red hat noticeably absent but his presence unmistakable. He caught her eye and smiled, making his way over to where she stood. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, shaking her hand warmly. Margaret chuckled. "Likewise," she said, "but I'm glad you came." They sat together during the meeting, exchanging knowing glances as speakers took the stage to share their stories and ideas. By the end of the night, they had exchanged phone numbers, promising to stay in touch and continue their conversations. Over the next few months, Brian and Margaret found themselves unexpectedly drawn into a larger movement within their community. What began as a simple conversation between two individuals soon inspired a wave of discussions, initiatives, and events aimed at bridging divides and fostering understanding. It started with Brian. Energized by his talk with Margaret, he took a leap of faith and reached out to his local community center. He pitched an idea, a series of dialogues where people with opposing views could come together to share their perspectives in a respectful, moderated environment. Initially, the response was tepid. The director of the center, a middle-aged woman named Elena, looked skeptical as Brian laid out his vision. "You're asking people to voluntarily walk into a room where they know they'll face opposition," Elena said, tapping her pen on her desk. "That's a tall order." Brian leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I know it's not easy," he said, "but I think people are craving something like this. Look around. Everywhere you go, it feels like the only thing we know how to do is yell at each other. This could be different. It could be a chance to listen." Elena studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "All right," she said. "Let's give it a shot. But don't expect miracles." Brian left the meeting feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. He reached out to Margaret immediately, knowing she would have valuable insights. When he called, she answered on the second ring, her warm voice filling the line. "Brian, what a surprise," she said. "What's on your mind?" He explained his idea, detailing the conversation with Elena and his hopes for the dialogue series. Margaret listened intently, her experience as a teacher helping her see the potential pitfalls and opportunities. "That's ambitious," she said when he finished, "but I think it's worth pursuing. Do you have a plan for how to structure the discussions?" "Not really," Brian admitted. "That's why I'm calling you. I figured you'd have some ideas." Margaret chuckled. "Flattery will get you everywhere," she said. "Let me think about it and get back to you." True to her word, Margaret threw herself into brainstorming. She reached out to former colleagues, many of whom had experience facilitating tough conversations in classrooms and workshops. With their help, she developed a framework for the dialogue series, focusing on ground rules, active listening techniques, and prompts designed to encourage empathy. She also volunteered to co-lead the sessions with Brian, a proposition he eagerly accepted. The first session was held in a modest meeting room at the community center. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle, and a pot of coffee sat on a table at the back of the room. About a dozen people showed up, a mix of ages, backgrounds, and political affiliations. Brian recognized a few faces from around town, while others were strangers. Margaret opened the session with a brief introduction. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice steady but warm. "It takes courage to show up for something like this, and I want to acknowledge that. Tonight, we're not here to change each other's minds or argue. We're here to listen and share." Brian followed her lead, sharing a bit about his own experience and what had motivated him to start the series. He kept it short, wanting to make room for the participants. When it came time for the group to introduce themselves, there was a palpable mix of hesitation and curiosity. A young woman with bright green hair spoke first, identifying herself as a college student studying environmental science. An older man wearing a faded veteran's cap introduced himself as a retired truck driver. One by one, the participants shared snippets of their lives, each revealing a piece of what had brought them to the room. The discussion began tentatively, with participants sticking to safe topics like their favorite books and hobbies. But as the evening progressed, the conversation deepened. Margaret guided the group skillfully, using open-ended questions to encourage reflection and discourage defensiveness. When tensions occasionally flared, she and Brian stepped in, gently redirecting the dialogue. By the end of the session, there was a noticeable shift in the room. People who had entered as strangers, or even potential adversaries, were beginning to see each other in a new light. One participant, a middle-aged woman named Carla, summed it up best as she prepared to leave. "I didn't expect to agree with everyone," she said, "and I still don't. But I think I understand them a little better now. That's something." Encouraged by the success of the first session, Brian and Margaret worked tirelessly to expand the program. Word spread quickly, and attendance grew with each meeting. The dialogue series became a fixture in the community, attracting people from all walks of life. Local businesses began sponsoring the events, providing refreshments and supplies. The media even took notice, with a reporter from the local paper attending a session and publishing a glowing article about the initiative. One evening, as Margaret and Brian were packing up after a particularly lively discussion, Elena approached them with a proposal. "I've been thinking," she said, her arms crossed. "This program is doing a lot of good, but I think it could do even more. Have you considered taking it to schools?" Brian glanced at Margaret, who was already nodding. "That's a great idea," she said. "If we can teach young people these skills early on, imagine the impact it could have." Elena smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already reached out to a few principals, and they're interested. Let's set up some meetings." The transition to working with schools brought its own set of challenges. Margaret and Brian had to adapt their approach to suit younger audiences, incorporating interactive activities and relatable examples. But the effort paid off. Students embraced the program with enthusiasm, often surprising their teachers with their insights and maturity. At one high school, a senior named Javier stood up during a session to share a personal story. His voice trembled as he described how his family had been affected by immigration policies and how he had struggled to reconcile his experiences with the perspectives of his peers. When he finished, a classmate who had been vocal about his support for stricter border control spoke up. "I never thought about it like that," the classmate admitted, his tone thoughtful. "I guess I've only seen it from my side. Thanks for sharing." Moments like these became the heart of the program, reaffirming its importance and impact. Margaret and Brian found themselves busier than ever, balancing their community work with their personal lives. For Brian, the experience was transformative. He no longer felt defined by the hat he had worn that day in the coffee shop. Instead, he saw himself as part of something bigger, a movement toward understanding and connection. Margaret, too, felt a renewed sense of purpose. In her years as a teacher, she had always believed in the power of education to change lives. Now she saw that belief validated in a whole new way. As the program grew, so did its reach. It wasn't long before neighboring towns began asking for guidance on starting their own dialogue initiatives. Brian and Margaret traveled to share their experiences speaking at conferences and workshops. Their story resonated with audiences, inspiring others to take up the mantle of bridge building in their own communities. One evening, after a particularly successful event, Brian and Margaret sat together in a quiet diner, sipping coffee and reflecting on their journey. "Did you ever think it would turn into this?" Brian asked, his voice filled with wonder. Margaret laughed softly, shaking her head. "Not in a million years," she said, "but I'm glad it did. It's a reminder that even the smallest actions can have ripple effects." Brian nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's funny," he said. "That day in the coffee shop, I felt so angry, so alone. I never imagined it would lead to something like this." Margaret reached across the table, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. "Sometimes it takes a moment of discomfort to spark real change," she said. "And you were brave enough to take that moment and turn it into something meaningful." Brian smiled, gratitude evident in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You believed in me when I wasn't sure I even believed in myself." Margaret's eyes twinkled with warmth. "That's what friends are for," she said simply. As they left the diner and walked into the crisp evening air, they couldn't help but feel hopeful about the future. The work ahead was daunting, and the challenges were far from over. But they knew they weren't alone. They had each other, and they had the growing network of people who shared their vision. Together, they had turned a moment of division into a movement of unity, proof that even in the most polarized times, connection was possible. And as they walked down the street side by side, they carried that hope with them, ready to face whatever came next. As Margaret and Brian continued to expand their dialogue program, the movement began to attract more attention beyond their local community. It wasn't long before regional news stations caught wind of their efforts, and soon the pair found themselves interviewed on a popular morning show. Sitting under the bright lights of the studio, they answered questions about their journey with humility and passion. "What's been the most surprising part of all this for you?" the host asked, her tone genuinely curious. Margaret leaned forward, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I think it's realizing how many people want to connect but feel like they don't have the tools or the opportunity," she said. "When we give them a space to be heard without judgment, it's amazing how quickly walls start to come down." Brian nodded in agreement. "And it's not just about politics," he added. "It's about understanding each other as people. Once we strip away the labels, we find that we have more in common than we think." The host smiled, clearly impressed. "You've turned a single moment of conflict into something transformative. What advice would you give to others who want to do the same in their own communities?" Margaret responded without hesitation. "Start small," she said. "You don't need a big platform or a lot of resources to make a difference. It can begin with a conversation, a shared meal, or even just listening to someone with an open mind." "Exactly," Brian chimed in. "It's about taking that first step and being willing to get uncomfortable. Growth doesn't happen in our comfort zones." The interview aired the following morning, and the response was overwhelming. Emails poured in from viewers who had been inspired by their story, many of them sharing their own experiences with division and reconciliation. Teachers, pastors, business owners, and even local politicians reached out, eager to bring the dialogue model to their communities. Margaret and Brian suddenly found themselves navigating an entirely new challenge: how to scale their efforts while maintaining the personal, intimate nature that had made them so impactful. They decided to create a formal organization to support their work. With the help of a few trusted allies, Elena included, they established the Bridge Project, a nonprofit dedicated to fostering constructive dialogue and building community resilience. They set up a small office in an old brick building downtown, where they worked tirelessly to develop resources, train facilitators, and organize events. Margaret joked that she was busier in retirement than she had ever been during her teaching career. One of their first major initiatives as a nonprofit was hosting a regional summit on dialogue and community building. Held in a local convention center, the event brought together people from all over the state, including educators, community leaders, and activists. Workshops covered topics like conflict resolution, empathy-building exercises, and strategies for navigating difficult conversations. Margaret led one of the sessions herself, drawing on her experience as a teacher to engage participants in meaningful discussions. Brian, meanwhile, found his place as the public face of the organization. His authenticity and straightforward demeanor resonated with people, making him a powerful advocate for their mission. At the summit's closing session, he stood before an audience of hundreds, sharing his story once again and emphasizing the importance of perseverance in the face of division. "This isn't easy work," he admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "There are times when it feels like we're trying to push a boulder uphill, but then I remember the faces of the people we've connected with, the conversations we've had, the moments of understanding. That's what keeps me going." The summit was a resounding success, sparking a wave of interest that extended far beyond their original community. Requests for workshops and partnerships flooded in, and the Bridge Project quickly gained a reputation as a leader in fostering dialogue across divides. Margaret and Brian found themselves traveling more frequently, visiting cities and towns across the country to share their message. One particularly memorable trip took them to a small rural town in the Midwest. The local high school had invited them to lead a series of sessions with students and faculty, hoping to address tensions that had arisen in the wake of a controversial school board decision. The town was deeply divided, and Margaret and Brian knew they were walking into a delicate situation. On the first day, they met with a group of students in the school gymnasium. The atmosphere was tense, with cliques visibly segregated by social and political lines. Margaret began by acknowledging the challenges the town was facing, emphasizing that their goal was not to assign blame, but to create space for honest dialogue. "Let's start with something simple," she said, her voice calm and inviting. "I want each of you to think about a time when you felt misunderstood. What happened, and how did it make you feel?" The students hesitated at first, exchanging wary glances. But slowly, one by one, they began to share their stories. A young girl with a shy demeanor spoke about being teased for her family's economic struggles. A boy wearing a football jersey admitted feeling judged for his religious beliefs. As the stories unfolded, the room began to soften, the tension giving way to empathy. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? What are your thoughts on the coffee shop refusing service over a MAGA hat? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.